So because this is, because we don't have an actual sphere to do these from, we're just going to do a theoretical exercise, and we're going to kind of approach it as we would approach a head. So this application of paint is going to be similar to how we would do this process if we were painting a portrait. So I'm sure you already know from drawing that the likeness and the quality of the description of the type of light that we're using is all in the drawing. So if you couldn't draw a portrait, you have very little hope of painting a portrait. This obviously gives you that ability to settle all those drawing issues in paint before we, in black and white, before we lay into the color. You can really get better and more familiar at all this tiling stuff. If I can just set this up here. At all this tiling stuff in black and white, and you need to become good at it before we switch to color. If you, let's do this right here. If your painting here came out choppy and not smooth and unflattering, it's probably because you didn't handle your transitions delicately enough. So you probably should have spent more time being more careful mixing intermediate transitions in your painting before you try to blend it out. And so that'll prepare, that's a good sign for color. If we were to have done this in body color, then you have to be even more certain that you don't jump ahead too soon, blend too soon. You have to make extra certain that each of these is described by a color transition. And then when I lean back here, it looks pretty fluid, and then I'm just softening edges for aesthetic reasons, because I want to break up that little transition between color shades. But again, and this is something we've said before, all of the changes in form should be apparent in the tiling and not in the softening of the edges. So I waited until this was fairly three-dimensional, had all my transitions before I went in and put the soft brush on there. To lay the paint on, we would, traditionally in the Flemish technique, we would do something like a small, thin sable brush where we would lay kind of little hatch marks of color on there. And then once we've distributed some color all around, we'd take a larger brush. Does anyone see it? I brought a stack of brushes here. The big white one that Fox was carrying around. No, I'm not sure where they're at. But you guys have probably seen it earlier this week or last week. No. That one that Fox was eating, it looked like a giant makeup brush. Yeah. That was made of goat hair. Super soft. Super soft and poofy. So we would sort of lay the paint on in the little hatch marks of color, and then we would take that big soft poofy brush and just spread it all out like you would soften your makeup on.
Is it like goat hair?
Yeah. So we'll, let's see, these are new brushes, so we can try to use these here. Let's see.
Did you happen to record while you were painting the sphere?
No, this was so elementary that if you can't do this, you shouldn't even be really trying to do anything else in this class until you can paint a sphere like this. Is there anybody who doesn't have their sphere today? Did you all bring it?
I have a sphere.
Okay.
It doesn't look like
It's not smooth as this.
Okay, yeah. I certainly recommend not working in color at all until you can do something like this. You're working out of a book, so you're not having to translate values too much or color or translate what you see. You're just having a copy out of the book. So you just need to use a smaller brush, most likely. Layer on the paint. Not be lazy about bloop, 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 all the licking the canvas. Mix a stroke, lay it up there. Mix a stroke, lay it up there. And be really critical about the value adjustments. It's just like drawing, but it's with paint. So it's Nothing different here. And you know, that's why I wanted you guys to do a year of drawing. If you had not done any drawing at all and you tried to do something like this, it would probably be even a larger disaster. So this is your first shot at it, so don't beat yourself up too much. You can always go home and try this again. Just keep in mind, our subjects are only going to get more complex than this. So focus on getting it right here before tackling something more challenging. We're going to use our limited palette here to do this. If I can find the colors.
It's next to the brush, and
Apparently.
it's next to your brush.
So let's see. I don't seem to have any of my paints down here anymore.
Bob saved them all?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Sheila came down here yesterday. She said the doors were
What
propped
you're looking
open.
for is behind the panel like this.
There's a ton on the floor.
It's a big brush, that's not it? But that big brush behind the panel's not what you're looking for?
No, that's just a big whistle brush. So let's see. Terra Rosa. I can use Terra Rosa instead of alizarin, so I'll just glaze with that. It's not as transparent, so it won't do the job as well. And there's a little yellow ochre here left over.
Carrie probably did it.
Yeah, Sheila said she came here in the evening and the door to the basement had been propped open. She didn't know who was here, so I might be absent this week.
So are we using multiple colors?
I want you to be working in a limited palette here, so
Right behind your canvas, there's a big brush.
no, that's a bristle brush.
Okay.
I want you to, the limited palette that we're working, or we have been working with, is the yellow ochre, the ivory black, and the alizarin. Now there is 100% in a glazed picture, no need for you to be using any ivory black in this, because you used ivory black for your underpainting here. This is as blue as you can get. It's as blue goes in a limited palette like this. So we're not going to be even laying out ivory black today because it's all on your painting already. The challenging thing sometimes about glazing colors is that we have to mentally extract what it is we see, extract the colors from what it is we see. So, you know, you're not looking at anything today while you do this. It's just kind of an experiment for you to see how the paint handles and how it flows over, and what happens when we add the medium to it. But when we are to observe something like a portrait, you know, we look at, let's just randomly take an example here. This Daniel Green painting, or I think maybe even a pastel drawing. But if we look at a portrait like this, or even a human, one of us, we try to look at the colors that we're seeing here. So there's a lot of yellows in here, there's some reds in here, and then there's some greenish colors in here. So we use our understanding of red, yellow, and blue with the fact that we've already put the blue up and we can only add red and yellow to figure out what we need to add to get to something like this. So if it's an orangish color, we're going to have to add greater amounts of red and yellow, not just only to make it orange, but to overcome the blue influence. If we want something to be greener, we already have the blue on here, so we're just adding bits of yellow. And if we want something to be really red, we're going to have to push the red quite a bit more. So it's going to be this balance of finding out today how much color do we add on top of this while still keeping it relatively transparent to get the colors that we're seeking out here. Now the values have already been resolved for the most part. It will get a little darker as we glaze because we're putting darker colors on top of this. So it's going to lower the value overall. So we can anticipate that.
So you'll get optical blending. If you put yellow on there, you'll get green, and that's because of optical blending. It's not because you're blending paint.
Right, we're not actually mixing the colors. We're letting light pass through a yellow film, then light bounce off of a blue film, and then come back. So because of that, the colors should be more jewel tone and luminescent. Now ideally, if we had more time than we do today, we would want to let each of these colors be relatively dry, or well, completely dry, in between each layer. So I would do the blue layer first, and then I would come in with most likely the red layer, and then on top of that, the yellow layer. Historically, I think they put the red layer last though, because faces in older paintings, you see, are mostly yellow, and then there'll be like little rosy sections of the cheek or whatnot.
Isn't it the most transparent of the three colors too?
Historically, yes. Yeah, so historically the red would be more transparent.
So you're
And
saying
then
the blue, then the red, then
we'll do blue, yellow, and then red.
the yellow.
We'll just go with that. And then, so you'll get ahead with the blue here, which is a very mild blue. One reason we're starting with this blue. If you're to do a portrait, to paint one of us, and you start with something like an ultramarine blue, which would not have been common historically, you would have a super, super blue face. And then as you add the yellow tints to it, it would become vibrantly green. And it would not look like a human at all. So if we look at the writings of, say, Joshua Reynolds, he talks about how he starts with his ivory black base and then does his yellow tints, perhaps modified with a little bit of red. And then once that's dry, the red accents go in and then our highlights go in. So we could still put a highlight on top of this, which will be something like yellow or a yellow-red with a bunch of white in it. And that would be our final dab on there to give us the ability to capture any available light in the room and add a little bit of three-dimensionality to it. But we would end up doing that after this layer had dried. So today we're basically going to be combining the yellow and red layers, but I'll add the yellow first, and then on top of that I'll add the red. Keep in mind, if I add equal amounts of red, yellow, and blue, it's going to end up neutral, right? Now the pigments I'm adding on top are stronger than the pigments, than the ivory black. So I'm using, my alizarin is not here, so I'm going to use Terra Rosa and yellow ochre. Those have stronger power than the ivory black. So I would therefore use less of them to tint the color.
And Tim, you were talking about when you put the yellow on, it would have a green cast. If you really wanted yellow, then you just use more yellow in it?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. We tint it more. And you know, you have to keep in mind there's no yellow in that we see that's actually darker than, you know, like a mid-value yellow. So the blue loses its influence as it gets lighter and lighter. So we typically see yellows in a light range, and it'll be easier to make yellow in a light range with glazing. So it'll all sort of make sense there. Let's see. I'm going to thin it down a little bit more than that here. Now some people will say to add a ton of medium in here and then just make it super transparent before you add it on. You'll find out that's actually not the best idea because the colors will start to separate in the medium when you throw it up there, or it might just get so runny that it runs off. It's the same sort of bricks and mortar thing. You don't want to end up with so much mortar, in this case oil, that there's not enough pigment to support it. So we're going to have to make sure we just use a color with a little bit of medium and then spread it out. And if it's a transparent color, in the case of like your alizarin crimson, then it's going to be so transparent when you spread it out that you're not even really going to need it. You'll just a little bit of that spread all over, and you'll get the effect of the red. Do you have a question, Pam?
Yeah, how are you deciding where, you know, where to put what color? I mean, are you putting yellow on everything and then...
Just about everything.
Okay.
Yeah, that you know, I'm trying to imagine this kind of like a head as well. So I know that there's nothing in the head where I want pure blue showing through, and in fact, if anything, it's going to be greenish right at the halftone of the head. And then in the background, if I recall from our earlier exercises, with a yellow lamp on the dark background, it was kind of a yellowish red, but really, really dark. So I'm still going to put stuff back there. Now, we would actually want to go off of observation if we were to see this. Now, upstairs in this theoretical exercise, if when we did have the balls that we could see this, there was no area that was super green. There were some areas that were kind of a low chroma blue just in the background. maybe up here where there wasn't as much light, or actually over here where there wasn't as much light hitting it. Oh, it's this one, that's why. So in cases like that, I'll end up having less yellow. I'll probably transition from yellow to red over here, so that it goes from orangish to a purplish, and that'll kind of describe what the light was. So for now, I'm just going to add a whole bunch of paint in here, kind of evenly laid on.
What's the advantage of using a tiny little brush?
Well, typically it would be to control or modulate the amount of, almost like tiling.
So you want the black to show through, or the darker, the background?
Yeah, well, the black will show through, yeah, ultimately. And if you use a big brush, you may lay too much on, so that it becomes opaque, and you don't want it to become opaque.
So the combination of the black background and darker background and the yellow makes it more of a green? Is that
Yes,
your
it
objective?
will once it's blended in there. So now you could use just a big soft brush like that goat hair brush. Some people will dip it into a lot of medium, rub it on the palette, get it really thin, and just sort of do a wash over that. But again, with that, you run the risk of potentially getting it too thinned out or too stretched out with medium.
And there's no need at this point to worry about the line, so to speak, staying in.
Right, that's going to all be knocked down.
Okay.
The better the brush you have to blend it out with, the more it'll be knocked down. See if we can see how well this one does. Simeon's not here, so I can't go up and get a new goat blender here. So we'll just soften this out. So remember, our goal is to make a sphere that looks as if it's got the bright yellow light on it. I'm going to have to do the yellow side as well, but I just want to make sure I get this blended in before it sets up too much. So it's definitely taking on more of a greenish look to it, which is what I want at this stage. Background in here.
How long before it sets up? I mean,
It depends on the medium you use.
Okay.
I'm using Winsor & Newton blending and glazing medium, so to be honest, I have no idea. So that's why I opted for a little sooner to try this rather than later, because I don't want this to get too dry on here. And I really need that big soft brush. This is not quite distributing as much as I want. It's doing all right though. So typically I would want to add this stage first and then let this all dry and then come back and add my red. And then the last day I would come in and do any accents or highlights that I need to modify the color in any way. So the nice thing about something like this is if I decide that I added too much yellow and it became too overpoweringly yellow without enough influence of the dark, I can easily wipe away this color and preserve all of the drawing and all of the edge work that I've done. You'll also note too, and hopefully some of you caught that when I mentioned it before you did your sphere, that all of the edges are going to become typically a little bit softer when you do this glazing. So you want to paint some of the edges a little bit harder in some areas. And that'll give you a little more liberty to apply all of this. Now we're starting to get the look of a yellow lamp on our sphere. So you can use just regular oil to thin some of this out. Just keep in mind the blending and glazing mediums like the Winsor & Newton were formulated to overcome some of the yellowing tendencies of an oil. So this is quite a bit more pale in hue. It's usually not a huge issue though, because most of the glazings glazes that we add on here are of a warmer yellowish or reddish tone. So if that yellows over time, it's not a huge deal.
So are there yellows that are more transparent? Because this
Oh, yeah.
seems a little cloudy.
Yeah, this is not the most transparent yellow. So you are going to have to actually have some medium in here.
Yeah.
But this will certainly be transparent enough for a head. Keep in mind, we want this to be a very mellow yellow, as we add on the colors for a human head. You don't want it to stand out and be like a screaming yellow, or that will be kind of weird.
Simpson effect.
Simpsons effect, yes. But certainly the unevenness, I'll be going back in here and adding some more of this and softening that out as I go, just to try and even some of this out. It's not going to be, keep in mind, it's not going to be 100% transparent, even if you are using a transparent pigment, just because there has to be some opacity to exhibit the color. So there will always be a little bit of, well, for now it'll look kind of cloudy. And eventually, once it's all done, it'll just look naturally colored.
Have you worked with Hansen yellow?
Not usually, because it's so strong.
I mean, would that be more transparent than a,
Yeah, it is,
than
yeah.
a cadmium, for
Yeah.
example?
It certainly is. You just be careful using it on faces, is all. Good, 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 good. So if you're the type of person that is unsure about color and just likes to do this sort of licking thing where you're throwing color all over, you can notice this might be the process for you. Because you can figure out the drawing and get it all soft and blend it as much as you need to, let it sit, and then lay the color on however you want. Because I'm doing this one color at a time and I'm using transparency to affect the color transitions instead of using body color, then it's not going to get as muddy as it would otherwise.
Are you getting thicker on that side?
That's
at
what I
all
was
with
thinking
the-
too. It seems like
A little bit, but it's also darker on the undertone.
Okay, so it's not necessarily intentionally trying to put more on that left side.
No.
Right side. I mean.
No, I'm just trying to combat any potential unevenness in the paint application.
So
And
just-
because this is taped instead of mounted, my canvas is a little, you can see, bumpy and irregular, so that's picking up some of the glaze unpleasantly that it wouldn't otherwise if this had been mounted on here. So traditionally, glazed pictures are either on panel or on canvas that's going to be mounted to panel, and usually it's a low weave or low tooth.
So just to understand you correctly, you're saying that you're not using a transparent color because the chroma is too high? Or-
Well, we don't have a transparent yellow on your palette. And if I were painting a head, I wouldn't want to use something that's really lemony. I think there are some earth tone yellows that are a little more transparent. But this will be adequate for our process.
So Tim, you're using a different brush for your blending.
Mhm.
Are you wiping it off in between, or it's not?
No, it's actually so dry now
Okay.
that there's not really even any color on it, because since I'm just using it for softening, it's not picking up too much pigment.
Okay.
So sable would be really nice for that, right? Would it? A sable brush?
Yeah, for most glazing purposes, yeah. Because remember, you don't want to end up having anything that's raised on this.
Well, since the canvas would really chew up the sable, would you be better off going to a synthetic?
Chew up the
Because they're
sable.
cheaper?
Well, like I said, you don't really do a lot of glazing on really toothy canvas. Typically, it's on low weave or board, so you don't really have as much issue of your brushes being chewed up too much.
Okay. You control the chroma by how much medium you put in there?
A little bit, and either by how much medium you're putting in or how dispersed or broken I'm making these strokes. So if I make a lot of strokes close together, it's going to be a higher pigment load in that area like that. If I space them out, then the pigment will be a little more evenly distributed. That may have been a little too much pigment in there, so I'll go ahead and lift some of that off with the paper towel. Right. So I want lower pigment influence on the halftone here so I can retain the greenish look later on. Then I can do a little bit higher in the closer to the center plane here. And then what I'll end up doing is coming in here toward the end and adding an opaque highlight at the right at the center there. Take a little more chrome around here. Help turn that form a little. So now we can think about we've turned the form as much as we can with value, which there's a limit to how much we can utilize there. Now we're focusing on turning the form with color. So pushing the chroma or reducing the chroma to help pull things forward or make things recede. So sort of what we've talked about before, only now we get to handle it at a very distinct stage of the process, separate from when we handle the drawing. It also helps us not get confused. If we were to see this setup in person, I've already painted it to be as bright and as luminous as I can with black and white. So I'm not inadvertently making these colors too chalky trying to get the chroma that I see. So that's really nice. And so now I can have this ability to really have more focus just on chroma. Like, is it being bright because of the value or is it being bright because of the chroma? So even something like this, if I increase the chroma load down here now, even though I'm not changing the value, it's making it look brighter, like the reflected light is brighter down there, and that's just because there's more pigment, more chroma. So I can play that down by lifting some of it off, or I can play it up. That's what you can play around with at this stage. And we can think of these things more theoretically as well, which is kind of nice, where sometimes you don't even need to have your subject or the sitter here while you're adding some of the color, because if you kind of know what color somebody is and you've got a good drawing underneath, you're basically just tinting it and then adjusting the chroma. Like if I painted Brittany, I could have Marin sit in for the color and just stand there, and I could sort of take some of the colors on her and apply it, and it would still look exactly like Brittany.
Used to use transparent colors to color photographs, black and white photographs.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of idea here.
And people had really rosy cheeks.
Right. Yeah, we'll give this guy a rosy cheek right in there. If your paint starts to get a little too splotchy and uneven, you may just have too much medium in there, so you may need to dial that back down and go to pure paint that you're spreading out a little more and kind of being a little more abrasive with. Yeah, I'd really like that big soft brush. That's all right. you'll do these big rows of value all the way across the top of the chart, and then you'll tint from the left side all the way over to almost the end of it with yellow, and then you wait for that to dry, and then you go the right side all the way over with red, and you modulate the influence as you go across.
It's a baseball.
Yeah, that's right. Let's see if we can scrub this on here.
And that or pool ball.
And did you thin this or not?
There was a little bit of the glazing medium.
Okay.
Oh, and that's a good thing to remember as well. Keep in mind, we're only going to extend the paint with oil or medium. We don't want to add thinner. So make sure you're not confused on that. You never want to use a thinner medium over a fatter medium.
I mean, that's not, the yellow is not completely dry.
Yeah.
You're actually blending your...
Yeah,
red.
so it's not going to be as rich and juicy, the exercise that we do here today, because we're actually physically blending the yellow and the red. I'm still showing you the process we would utilize if we were handling them independently, but we just have to do it all at once so I can kind of show you guys. And as such, the colors aren't going to be as rich and jewel-like as they would if we had waited a little bit, because then I could be really careful about putting in just a little bit of red and spreading it out so it has a very minor influence, whereas now it's basically the influence of the pigment as opposed to the influence of how I've glazed it. Does that make sense? If it starts to set up a little too much on here and you really can't work out your hatch lines, you can always add a little bit of medium or oil on there to spread it out. Make sure it stays nice and fluid on there. Remember, the point of this is that there shouldn't be many or any visible brush marks on there. We should be working just with or have just the marks of our underpainting, and that is all. It's a little too much red right at the halftone. Need to see if I can lift a little bit of that out.
And that's Terra Rosa, right?
I think so, yeah.
Sure.
Which again,
Whatever.
it's an opaque color, so it's not as transparent as I'd want it to be. Meaning, what you'll find is with the opaque colors, as you glaze them, they'll get darker a little faster in some areas. So, this halftone that I wanted to put red in is getting a little darker than what I wanted for a halftone, like right in here, because the color is so opaque instead of being transparent. So I run into that issue as well.
You had wanted to use the blizzard?
Yeah, it's transparent, yeah, so it's not going to have as much of a value impact as the opaque, what is this? Permanent rose or whatever it's I'm using. Terra Rosa.
That's fine.
So we're really going for this look of a spotlight shining right on the ball here. You're doing pretty well. This occlusion shadow will need to get a little darker in here. So I could, again, this would be a situation where having a more opaque glaze color is nicer for an area, because I do want it to get even darker as I glaze this in here. Although I need more yellow.
You do that rather than using the black.
I should have had more yellow.
Well, he's not going to use any more black.
Yeah, I've already used the black. The black is dry.
For the occlusion.
Uh-huh. I could, for perhaps a dark accent, I could come in here and add it to get some black. But the colors you're using, as well as the the reference in general is going to dictate how much lighter you're going to have to make your underpainting. So that's something you're going to have to become familiar with. And doing those glaze charts, you'll start to, with a limited palette, since I'm having you do them with a limited palette, you'll become more familiar with the value impact that these colors are going to have on top of your underpainting. So you'll be able to key your underpainting to be a more appropriate value than they would be otherwise. So like right now, I may have even gone maybe a little bit lighter than I could have for some of the ball. That's actually pretty good. But you know, if you go too dark, then your white ball will no longer look white, and et cetera, et cetera. So doing the glaze charts is going to help you figure a lot of that out.
Now, the glaze chart you're talking about, the secondary ones we're doing with the,
No, those are stain charts.
oh, I see, okay.
That's second quarter, did you say that's when we would be doing these glaze charts?
Well, I would want you to do them before you start seriously working in this method. So if you're starting next quarter, if you plan on doing a lot of glazing for your coloring, then you need to have your glaze charts done before you come in. Because you don't want to spend a couple weeks on an underpainting and then realize that you didn't key it to the right value because you aren't experienced enough yet with your...
So you just do the glaze charts with a limited palette blending?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit fewer of them. But you just have to make sure you time it appropriately because you have a limited amount of time to do them in, so you need to make sure you let everything set up and dry in between the layers. Because you can expect on the glaze charts to have 3 layers, right? So your underpainting layer, which is your blue, and then the red and yellow on top of it. And for those, you know, I actually recommend mixing even a more neutral ground than just the blue. But that's kind of optional. They're somewhat flexible. So I'm getting more of this purplish look in here with the extra red, which is what I was wanting on this side, because I have less of the lamp influence over here, and then it starts to pick up the back wall of the box, shadow box that we have. On the floor here, though, there'd be very little red, because that light is actually hitting that pretty strongly. Just keep building this up. So ideally I want to fan this out to make sure that before it dries, it's a nice and clean film laid on here, just like I tinted it, instead of actually painted it. So there's still some softening that actually needs to be done all on here, but you guys can kind of get the idea of where I'm going with, especially with that background. And then at the end, if I had, let me see if lay in a little more value here. To get our final highlight, I'll show you that, and then we're going to cut you loose.
So as a general rule, if you're going to be glazing something, would you want the enclosed side to be a lighter value than?
Yep, and that's exactly how I told you to paint your sphere, right?
No.
No. Okay. Well, for those of you who listened, that's exactly how I told you to paint the sphere.
Like there was tissue, like we had a tracing paper over top of it.
Yes.
You said nothing darker than before.
Oops.
Oops. Well, it's all a learning process.
Thank you.
At least you picked up on that before we quit here today, Kathy. That's
So at
good.
least I picked up on the no brush strokes.
Yeah.
Letter stick.
We would color a head in this manner. This is actually quite a bit lighter even than a head would be, right? We wouldn't expect a face to be that bright because that's a white object here that we're painting. So you'd have to have a pretty pasty person under a pretty bright lamp. So that being said, we could key our painting even a little darker as we color this in. Yeah. And then so let's go ahead and lay in our opaque. Now this last bit here is optional.
Would you have keyed that prior to putting the coats of glazes over it?
Keyed what?
Keys your value. If you're saying this is a really bright person under a pasty light or pasty person under a bright light, you would want to key it
Or
at
your
a
grisaille
lower
should match
value.
what
Yeah,
you're
your
painting.
grisaille needs to be adjusted according to your subject. Yeah. Okay, so now typically we would have this a little darker. So let's say if this was a head on here, you know, something more like this, less glaringly bright. And then we would go to put in our accent, like on the nose or whatever. We would go in and add our more opaque color with our, if we're working with transparent stuff, it's going to be very strongly tinted. But we're working just with a yellow ochre here, so it's not super strong. But we would go in and we lay in a hard edged highlight just right in there for our final. And the nice thing about this is you make sure that you get to make sure that your highlights stay nice and hard edged because you don't have a bunch of paint that you're mushing around. Make it even a little bigger here for you guys. There we go. So we can really pick up that available light in the room and pump it up to the next level. So you can see this process will allow you a very methodical way to just tint your paintings. You need to soften all this out more. This needs lots of softening. Your largest, the cheap Sabeline brushes that I was having you guys get and use, if that's all you can afford, you know, those will be okay, especially the big one for this last bit of just coming around and making sure all your brush strokes are nice and soft. And those brushes were only like $1 if you can't afford one of those nice big makeup looking brushes that Simi has. The more you smooth it out, the cleaner this film will look. But again, I've got a lot of cleaning to do. And keep in mind too, because this had to be, I had to do the red and the yellow together, they'll appear somewhat broken on here. Instead of a clean continuous film of yellow and then a tinted film of red, it's going to be harder for me to get them to blend in now and be nice and smooth because I had to add them both while they were wet. So that's something to consider here. Whereas if I had added literally one at a time, I could really smooth it out, and then wait for it to dry, and then the next color, really smooth it out, and I wouldn't have to worry about any choppiness. Because when you come up here and look at this, you'll see a little bit of choppiness on here. Any questions on this?
Now, you didn't have time to go to the left, right?
Yeah, I would keep going, even in the background, because the background, you know, it's kind of greenish back here. I'd want it to be a little more on the orange side.
How many layers would you say you'd have to do to get like to get that kind of glowing, you know, that like luminescent quality?
Well, since you're typically using a glazing medium, which is going to be a little fatter, and also depends on the medium you use for that as well. If you use like a stand oil and varnish medium that's a little thicker, then you can do it in fewer coats. If you're going to use just a regular oil, you probably want maybe 4 or more coats. So we're talking about
would you rotate the colors as you did that?
Yeah.
So you do like yellow.
It would be like,
red.
yeah, your initial lay down, and then in this case like a yellow, and then a red, and then when all that's dry, you come back for your final touch-up coat. So that's 4, and then highlights on top of it. And then if you're working with a fattier medium, you can cut that down a little bit because they sort of dry as luminescent and enamel like.
So you could keep working on glazing indefinitely, really.
Well, you can. Just keep in mind, though, like the conservators will tell you that that multiple layers are unhealthy for painting over time, especially if you're going to be working on a flexible support like this, because every layer has a potential to crack. And if a layer in the middle cracks, then it could separate all the layers on top of it. So ideally, you know, shoot for fewer layers, and then if you want to really get that thick jewel-like, almost like it's made of stained glass look, use a fattier medium, one with like stand oil when you do the glaze, because then it'll level it all out and give you a little bit of thickness to it with the colors in it.
So you just have to wait longer then.
Yeah, you'd end up waiting. And typically we're waiting like a week at least in between coats for glazing like this. If you talk about the Flemish technique, it's like 40-something weeks long to go through all 7 steps.
And do you always, I guess I'm a little confused, do you always do the whole painting with the same color, or do you?
Usually, because you're only working, you can only work one color and one coat at a time. So you want to go all over, make a film, and then the next day come back and go all over and make a film.
So
As opposed to, if we're working with body paint, we'd probably resolve an area before moving on.
Okay.
So if you have 3 balls and there's one red, one yellow, one blue,
Uh-huh.
and you do an open corsage or a closed corsage, the yellow and the red I could understand, then what do you do with the blue? Would you go back in like with an ultramarine, with a blue rather than allowing the ivory black to
Well, not in the
stay?
case of a limited palette, but yeah, if you're going to go a full color palette, you could.
Okay. So if you're using limited palette, you're kind of allowed for the blue ball?
Yeah.
But you're still showing the color of light, right? You're influencing everything with light, so there might still be a little yellow.
Well, yeah, it depends. If it was a yellow ball with a, a blue ball with a yellow light, then you would just use ivory black and a yellow, and that would be fine.
Yeah, okay.
So you have to actually look and see what the color of the object is. The tricky part about this is that you have to become good at mentally extracting the colors of what it is you see. Like, if I look at Pam's face and I remove all the yellows and reds, what does it look like? If I remove all just the reds and have the yellows, what does it look like? And so you have to kind of plan ahead for that.
You mentioned the 7 steps.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recap that?
You want each of the steps? Well, not all of them are painting, actually. There's only a couple layers of glazing in the Flemish. So the first would be an ink drawing, or a drawing that's been fixed. I can't remember if that's actually one of the steps, but it always starts with that. Then
That would be on a canvas or panel?
a panel, typically. Well, it's on.
Well, either way,
Yeah, it doesn't
I just
really
meant-
matter.
As a base for what your veg is gonna build.
Yeah, if you're gonna glaze, I would recommend doing it on a panel, not a canvas, like all these steps.
Like Indian pink?
Yeah, yeah. Then the next step is your open grisaille. And sometimes that's broken into 2 layers. And it's usually a sepia tone. So there's typically, after the drawing, there's the first pass at that, and then the second pass at that to fully develop it. And then you do a dead layer, which is a closed grisaille.
Is that
On
the
top of
third
that.
step or the fourth?
It depends if you count the drawing and stuff. So the closed grisaille can be done in ivory black, but typically it's actually done in a mixture of red, yellow, and blue to produce a dead color, no chroma leaning anywhere. And that's closed grisaille, made with that. And then you would then do your next 3 steps would be the glazes of the various reds, yellows, and blues. Sometimes you can combine different colors into one step. If you say have no need to put a color in one area, you can add the other colors that you're going to put in that area instead. So that would be usually 2 steps of glazing, sometimes 3. And then on top of that, you put on all your final opaque details and stumbles. So keep in mind that glaze is tinting the color and lowering its value. A scumble would be adding some color with a higher, raising the value. So a scumble is kind of like, we know what a scumble is. We're like dry brush scrubbing on, but we would do that if we wanted to, say, raise the value in here and add some color, and you would have it broken enough to allow some of this undercolor to show through. So it wouldn't be completely a full body stroke. So then you still get some of the advantages of a transparent glaze, but it's a little more opaque.
You would not do dry brush at all on this?
Well, the Flemish technique, there's usually no brush work, is the goal. So with that technique, you typically are waiting a month or 2 in between steps.
Oh,
Because you want your layers to dry completely.
There's nothing
That's why
worse
almost nobody does it.
than spending hours on something.
People want to get their paintings to the gallery in like 3 months. They don't want to spend a year doing the painting. Anyway, so if you end up wanting to do glazed paintings, typically the artists that are doing them have lots of paintings going at the same time, anywhere from 5 to 10.